What's going on, guys? My name is Triforce Addiction. Welcome back to another COD Mobile video. So a few days ago, there was a Q&A that the devs were actually doing, and this is something that I kind of discovered yesterday into the night. And it's actually sparks of a lot of important conversations that needed to be had, especially when it comes to Gunsmith and just the wildcard system. And this was the first Q&A. I was actually happy to hear actual news, because whenever there's a Q&A, there's always just a bunch of idiots asking, oh, when is the mythic Kilo 141 coming back? And those types of questions should be saved for something important. So since we barely got wildcards in this game, it was kind of important that we learn a little bit more about the future of this new system. So at the very beginning of this update, we ended up getting 4 different wildcards. One, of course, was Bomber, the other one was Tactical Shift, as well as Overkill and the red perk Greed. Of course, with Bomber and Tactical Shift, I'm sure a lot of people didn't really pick that. The 2 main highlighted wildcards were obviously the red perk Greed and Overkill. And apparently the devs have, I guess, data to show us who picked what. Well, not who picked what, but basically what the entire community picked over which. And apparently in the Chinese server, they actually chose the red perk Greed more than Overkill, because I know when wildcards were announced, a lot of people were assumed to pick Overkill over anything. And no, I actually kind of knew this going in, that Overkill wasn't really going to be much of a big deal. In fact, I've actually faced a lot of people already that have Overkill, and in most cases, I didn't even know that they had Overkill. I just thought they just switched different classes. For a long time, Overkill was kind of that thing that a lot of people were afraid would make its way into the game, because they probably thought it was going to be overpowered. But now that's already officially in the game, it's not really that big of a deal at the end of the day. I think a lot of people picked the red perk because it was a lot more helpful. I don't really think anything has to be said about the other 2 wild cards, those. I don't really think a lot of people picked those in the first place. But it also raised the question, especially when it comes to the perk Greed. So yes, we do have the red perk Greed that allows us to use 2 red perks instead of 1. But a lot of questions kind of came to be about, what's going to happen with the blue and the green perk Greeds. Someone did ask, and they asked, will perk Greed, green or blue, come to multiplayer? And they answered by saying, these wildcards might come sometime in the future, but we have to consider about whether the players accept and adapt to the new wildcards or not, and also considering about the potential balancing issues as well. So this was probably one of the biggest questions that we had in terms of the wildcard system, because I know, a lot of people were asking why we didn't have a green or blue perk Greed. And the answer is pretty simple, because the red perk Greed, red perks in general don't really have any perks that are really game breaking. Yes, you have the ability to have more lethals or more tacticals with those recharge perks. And let's say you have an enemy that's just spamming Molotovs. I mean, you have the option to put Flak Jacket and Dauntless together. So they might have some overpowered aspects to the red perk portion, but it's not something that's really that big of a deal, since you could counter them. You also have the ability to have, I guess, more speed, if you want to use Skulker and Lightweight together. But again, it's not destroying the game's pace in any sort of significant way. People are not complaining about it. It's different with the green and blue perks, because they have very different game-breaking types of perks if you mix them together. So for example, if you have Quick Fix and Scavenger together, you're going to be healing all the time, to the point where the time to kill is going to be a lot more inconsistent. If you guys remember back when Quick Fix was extremely overpowered, where it didn't have a recharge time, and the time to kill became very weird, because you're trying to kill people that just killed another person, and they're constantly healing while you're shooting at them. So instead of having it be a 4 or 5 shot kill, you would have to end up killing that person in maybe 7 to 8 shots. It created a lot of inconsistencies with the time to kill that a lot of players were kind of complaining about it. So imagine if you were able to put Vulture and Quick Fix together. Basically, I'm not going to say you're going to be invincible, but it's going to be way harder to kill you. And keep in mind, there's no counter to that. Not only that, you could also make yourself a complete ghost if there is a green perk Greed. I mean, you could have Hardwired and Ghost together, so you could basically never be detected by any AI, such as, helicopters or sentry guns, which I don't really think that's much of a broken thing, especially in ranked, because there's less score streaks. But you guys get the point. I think the main concern with having a green perk Greed is the fact that, you know, people are going to be mixing quick fix with vulture. As for the reason for not having a blue perk greed, I mean, it's pretty obvious. I think the only main concern with that one is people putting persistence and hardline back together, which again is going to bring back the persistence meta that a lot of people hated back in the day. And if you guys remember, a lot of players got a lot of unearned wins in ranked because of that. Even if the score streaks are separated by tiers, like for example, you can't put an attack chopper with like a sentry or something like that. You know, even with the restrictions that it has, I think it would still be too much of an issue. But as for other combinations with the blue perk, I can't really imagine a lot of broken combinations other than those two. Maybe having like dead silence and alert, but I mean, even then, I don't really picture a lot of players doing that. If anything, most of the balancing issues with perk greed would probably stem from the green perk. So it kind of makes us understand why red perk greed was chosen over the other two, because it's the one that causes the least amount of issues. And again, I've looked all over Twitter, I've looked all over YouTube, there's not a lot of people complaining about the red perk greed. But besides the perk greeds, we also have to talk about another one that a lot of people wanted to see, which was primary gunfighter. So if you guys don't know what that is, primary gunfighter basically allows you to put more attachments on your primary weapons. Yes, so this one's a little bit complicated because like the gunsmiths for a lot of weapons are a bit different from each other. So, you know, there'll be some weapons that have a certain set of attachments, or there'll be like another weapon that has less attachments than another one. The thing is with primary gunfighter, it's worked differently in different games. So for example, if you played like Black Ops 3 or Black Ops 2 or something like that, when there was primary gunfighter, it only really allowed you to use one extra attachment, but there are other versions of primary gunfighter that basically let you set up a like basically all attachment slots. So when this question was asked whether or not it would be in the game, they said, we're not considering adding this wildcard at the moment, and 8 attachments is not possible for the current gunsmith ecosystem. So personally, I like the answer, but at the same time, I think they're overthinking it because, I mean, again, primary gunfighter has worked in like various different ways. Again, you could have a total of like 10 attachments. I think Vanguard did that. But at the same time, you don't have to let the player have like 8 attachments. I mean, you could let them only use 1 extra attachment or have 2 extra attachments or something like that. It doesn't have to be 8. Maybe this is them kind of hinting that they're probably going to overhaul the gunsmith system at some point, but at the same time, you don't really have to do that if you just allow people to use 1 extra attachment. You don't have to do all that work just to make 1 wild card work. But notice the keyword, it did say gunfighter, so chances are like they're gonna have this gunfighter wildcard work for both primary and secondary weapons, because I know in other games they've had, you know, primary or secondary gunfighter like separately. So if they do have a gunfighter wildcard, they might make it so that it works for both like secondaries and primaries. But again, I think they're kind of overthinking it. I mean, I don't really think people are gonna care if they can't use 3 extra attachments. I mean, even if you limit it down to 1 or 2 extra attachments, I think the player base will be fine. Don't get me wrong, it will set up the meta differently. You know, there are certain weapons out there that would be great if you could have that 1 extra attachment, but I don't really think it's gonna like negatively affect the player base and have them thinking like, oh fuck, why can't I use 3 extra attachments? You know, like I don't think people are gonna think that. Again, you don't have to overhaul the entire gunsmith just to make 1 wildcard work. We did have a skillless moron also ask them whether or not there will be a chance of implementing a wildcard that helps gaining score streaks faster. And they said, we're considering adding a wildcard that functions somewhat like persistence, which all players can equip with. So unfortunately, apparently some sort of persistence-like wildcard is in the works. I'm not sure if that's going to appear like in season 4 or season 5, maybe in the later seasons later on this year, but I pray to God they don't. I mean, we already have persistence. I don't think we need anything else. And I've tried to think of some sort of solution for that could help, but I just can't think of anything. It would just break the game a little bit too much. Score streaks are kind of like a delicate thing. I mean, we learned from persistence how bad things can get when, you know, noob stuff is kind of just left unchecked. There's a reason why we never got combat focus as one of the operator skills. Because I remember how that stuff worked in Black Ops 3, where like you get like double or triple the points for your score streak. So imagine earning like a VTOL like in 2 kills. Like think about that. Imagine that was in the game. This question was also pretty interesting as well. They ask, will there be wildcards that are about secondary weapons, melees included, added into a game? So they said this idea is pretty interesting. We'll consider that. So it's clearly evident that they haven't thought about doing something with the secondaries. I don't really know what they could really do, but in terms of melees, the only idea that I could actually think of is maybe adding a functionality where, kind of like in BR, how you could have a primary and secondary weapon, but also have a melee to increase your speed. Maybe they could implement the feature into multiplayer. I mean, for controller players, I think we have to like hold Y to like switch to our melee in BR. So maybe adding something like that, maybe that could help, especially if you're, you know, wanting to put a different secondary other than just a knife all the time in search and destroy. In terms of for like just general secondaries such as pistols, maybe I guess secondary gunfighters are really the only thing I could think of. So this one part of the Q&A did kind of hit close to home because I've always said it was kind of stupid that we had to unlock wildcards only through ranked alone. And they basically asked, could you make wildcards easier to obtain in multiplayer? And they said, what we thought for the system is that within 20 ranked matches, you'll master the wildcards that you currently have and play with the next wildcard. So basically, their original idea was to basically have you pick a wild card and just use that for 20 games and then move on until you have all of them unlocked. So far, I've only played about enough to ranked matches to get me up to overkill. So now I have overkill and the red perk greed. But I will admit, again, it's pretty stupid that ranked is really the only way for you to get the wild cards. Because keep in mind, again, if you're on controller, you basically have no access to rank. You would have to demote yourself all the way down to rookie, which will take months for you to even be able to get more of those cards. But at the same time, I understand why they did, because the general population mainly plays ranked. So yeah, I mean, why not have it there? But I mean, you could have had options to unlock it through BR since that has its own rank system. I know they have their own wild cards, but they could have also allowed you to get some points for wild card unlocks for multiplayer as well. I don't know why they didn't do that. So that's basically all we need to cover right now for the wildcard system. They are open to changing some of them if they become a little bit too unbalanced. I think that's always something that's on the table. But I feel like that's something that they could do as well for the green and blue perk greeds, where they will limit certain combinations. So for example, if you're using the blue perk greed, you cannot put hardline or persistence together. You know, stuff like that. They could always limit things like that. I don't know why it's such a complicated concept for them. If it's in the name of balancing things out, I mean, you could limit certain combinations. It's not that hard. I mean, even with green perk greed, I mean, you could just say that if you're using quick fix, you can't use vulture. You know, it's not that complicated. But right now, as it stands, I don't think players have any sort of issues with any wild cards so far. I haven't really heard any complaints of people saying overkill is being a little bit too overpowered, or there's too many people abusing the red perk greed. I mean, I'm not seeing any of that. I think everyone's happy with what the wildcards are currently. I'm not going to say that it's going to be like that throughout the entire duration that COD Mobile is going to be around. I mean, they're probably going to add some sort of wildcard that makes the game extremely unbalanced at some point. It's bound to happen. But where it's at right now, I think people are kind of just satisfied. No one's complaining. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to leave a like, make sure to subscribe for some more COD Mobile content. I'll see you guys next time.